today's video. Before we continue on here with this video, let me first describe what this crash course is going to be. So this is just going to be the fundamentals of how HTML works. I have individual videos on all these, so the transitions between all these might not look completely beautiful, but you still get to see my beautiful face throughout these. I don't know. So HTML, the fundamentals. Let's get to the first video. Is going to be an introduction to HTML in my first video in my series that covers HTML for web developers. So first off, what is HTML? And I'm going to use the MDN docs to kind of supplement this video here. Now, HTML is a markup language that tells the web browsers how to structure the web pages you visit. It can be as complicated or as simple as the web developer wants it to be. The HTML page consists of elements here, which you can enclose, wrap, or mark up different parts of the content that make it appear. And real quick, HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. So you can see here, they use the terminology of markup to use HTML to make your content on your web page appear in different ways. Okay, so depending on what HTML you use, it can change how your web page is structured and change how the web browser interprets that HTML and presents that HTML to your end user that's actually using your web page. And then it goes on to say the enclosing tags can make content into a hyperlink to connect to other pages, italicize words, and so on. For example, consider the following. My cat is very grumpy. If we wanted the text to stand by itself, we could specify that this is a paragraph and enclose it in a paragraph element. So here you can see this is HTML right here. And if you want to present this text to your user, my cat is very grumpy, wrapping this in P tags here, these P elements. And in my next video, we're going to cover what HTML elements are. But if you do this, this is going to present this to the user as a paragraph. Now, if I wrapped this in H1 tags, which means that this is like your top level header of your web page or your top header of your web page, the browser is going to represent this differently to the user by default. And it's going to be like this big title at the top of your page. But with a paragraph text, it's just going to be something that kind of looks like this text right here. It's just going to look like a normal paragraph. Okay, so this HTML, you use it to structure your web page, and then your browser takes that HTML and it will present this content to the user depending on how you've structured your HTML. And you use this HTML as your structure, and then you go on to style that HTML with CSS, and then you can also add more interactivity with JavaScript. So for example, you might use HTML to create a button. So you might use button tags to say that you're going to submit a form. And then you might use CSS to style that form to make that form look all pretty and such. And then you would use JavaScript to then decide what you want to do when the user submits that form. So maybe after they submit that form, you want to store that data in a database. Well, you could do that using JavaScript, and that adds a little bit more of that interactivity to your web page, because then you could present to the user, okay, the form has been submitted successfully. You can now click this button to move to our homepage, and so on and so forth. But the HTML is going to be the structure of the page, and then you use CSS to style, JavaScript to add some interactivity, okay? So that is an introduction to what HTML is and what it's used for. In my next video, we're going to cover what an HTML element is and how that works. In my previous video, I gave an introduction on what HTML is, and in today's video, we're going to cover the anatomy of an HTML element, or what a HTML element is and how it really works. So let's kind of explore this example from MDN, Mozilla Developer Network. They have a great article on HTML here that I'm going to use to supplement this video. So here in this example here, you can see the kind of anatomy of this HTML element. And right here, this would be considered an HTML element. These P tags, the content, and then this p tag here. So first off, the opening tag. This consists of the name of the element, in this example, P for paragraph, wrapped in opening and closing angle brackets. So this right here is your opening tag. It is this P tag here, and it represents a paragraph, and you use a left angle bracket and a right angle bracket. This is the opening tag. This marks where the element begins to start to take effect. In this example, it precedes the start of paragraph text. And if it was like an H1 tag, it would signify the start of a header element text. And then you can see the second part of this element is the content. This is the content of the element. In this example is the paragraph text. So that is going to be right here. And then you also have the closing tag. This is the same as the opening tag, except that it includes a / before the element name. This marks where the element ends. Failing to include a closing tag is a common beginner error that can produce peculiar results. So here you can see the closing tag, and it's the same as the opening tag, except that it has this / right after your left angle bracket. So it goes left angle bracket, / the P, and then a right arrow bracket here. So the element is the opening tag, followed by the content, followed by the closing tag. So all this right here is considered the element. This is the opening tag, closing tag, and then your content. All right. And all this makes up an HTML element. And you can use different elements for various things. So you could have P tags, you can have input tags, you can have image tags, you can have header tags, you could have button tags, a whole bunch of different stuff. And then within those tags, you can kind of put some content that you want in your web page. And all of these elements are then used to structure your HTML, and then your browser will kind of know how to present that content to the user because of these different tags that you use. Now, you can also have tags within tags. And this is where we get into nesting elements. So elements can be placed within other elements. This is called nesting. If we wanted to state that our cat is very grumpy, we could wrap the word very in a strong element, which means that the word is to have stronger text formatting. So HTML used to have B tags, which would make an element bold, but that has been switched to strong. And it's going to kind of give it just like a darker appearance that makes it kind of stand out more strongly. And the way you do this is right here. So you still have your opening and closing P tags, and you still have my cat is very grumpy within it, but wrapping the word very, you can see that we have this strong tag. So we have the opening strong tag, closing strong tag, and then the content between. So this right here makes up an entire element, and it's within your overall paragraph element. So this says there is a right way and wrong way to do nesting. In the example above, we opened the P element first, then opened the strong element. For proper nesting, we should close the strong element first before closing the P tag. The following is an example of the wrong way to do nesting. So here in this example, you can see that it has the opening P tag, and then it has my cat is, and then the opening strong tag, and then you have very grumpy, and then it closes the P tag, and then closes the strong tag. So you can see that it's not like opening and closing the strong tag all within the P tag. It kind of opens the P tag, opens the strong tag, closes the P tag, closes the strong tag. And that is the incorrect way to do it. The tags have to open and close in the way that they are inside or outside one another. So it either has to be completely nested within an element or completely wrapping another element. It can't be like half in, half out. With the kind of overlap in the example above, the browser has to guess at your intent. This kind of guessing can lead to unexpected results. Okay, so you can nest elements within each other, but just make sure that it's completely nested with its opening and closing tags. Now you also have block versus inline elements. So there are two important categories of elements to know in HTML: block level elements and inline. Block level elements form a visible block on the page.
A block level element appears on a new line following the content that precedes it. Any content that follows a block level element also appears on a new line. So a block level element creates a completely new line on the web page. And anything that comes after it is going to go on a new line as well. So it takes up an entire kind of row of your web page. And this goes on to say, block level elements are usually structural elements on the page. For example, a block level element might represent headings, paragraphs, lists, navigation menus, or footers. A block level element wouldn't be nested inside an inline element, but it might be nested inside another block level element. Now, inline elements are contained within block level elements. They surround only small parts of the document's content, not entire paragraphs or groupings of content. An inline element will not cause a new line appear on the new document. It is typically used with text. For example, an A element creates a hyperlink, and elements such as EM or strong create emphasis. So here in this example, they wrap the words first, second, and third in opening and closing EM tags, and then they also enclose fourth, fifth, and sixth in paragraph tags. And you can see EM is an inline element. As you see in the example below, the first three elements sit on the same line with no space between. So here you can see first, second, third. These all sit on the same line here because they are wrapped in an inline element. So they don't go to the next line. They all go in the same line. Hence, inline element. On the other hand, the P tag is a block level element. Each P element appears on a new line with space above and below. So here you can see fourth, fifth, and sixth, they all create a new line for these P tags because a P tag or a P level element is a block level element. So they all create a new separate line here. And this says the spacing is due to default CSS styling that the browser applies to paragraphs. So that is another important thing to consider. The browser does apply certain default styles to your different elements depending on what the element is. Like paragraphs get this default style, and then header elements will get a larger font size and different styles like that. All right. So you have block level and inline elements, and then you also have void elements. And it goes on to say, not all elements follow the pattern of an opening tag, content, and closing tag. Some elements consist of a single tag, which is typically used to insert or embed something in the document. Such elements are called void elements. For example, the image tag embeds an image file into the page, and you can see it right here. These will also be called like self-closing tags, in which you can see that you have the opening IMG right here with a left angle bracket, then IMG, and then you have a couple of different attributes here, which we'll cover attributes in my next video on HTML, but then you just have a closing tag. So you see, this isn't an opening tag, nor is it really a closing tag. This is just a self-closing tag, in which it opens and closes all within the same tag here. And this is considered a void element. All right, so certain elements, they don't have the same pattern of opening tag, content, closing tag. They just kind of self-close like this. But when you're using HTML and you're like, okay, I want to use an image, or I want to use this or that, at first, you can just look these up and you'll be like, okay, this is just a self-closing tag. This is how I use this. And then over time, you'll kind of get the hang of what elements are self-closing and kind of a better feel for how that works. And one quick thing before I wrap up elements here that I think that you should know is tags in HTML are not case sensitive. This means they can be written in uppercase or lowercase. And then it goes on to show an example that the title tag could be written as lowercase title, all uppercase title, capital case title, or a collage of upper and lowercase letters. All those would work. However, it is best practice to write all tags in lowercase for consistency and readability. Okay. So that is what HTML elements are and how they work. In my next video, we will cover HTML attributes. In my previous two videos of this HTML series, we covered what HTML is, and then we also covered what elements are and how those kind of work. But there's one missing part of elements that we haven't talked about, and that is attributes. And that is what this video is going to be about. So diving into what attributes are and kind of how they work, elements can also have attributes. Attributes look like the following. So right here, we have a opening p tag, a closing p tag, and some content. So this is our overall element right here. But within the opening tag here, we have what's called an attribute. So this is saying class is equal to, and then a string editor-note. And what this is doing is attributes contain extra information about the element that won't appear in the content. In this example, the class attribute is an identifying name used to target the element with style information. So here we're setting a class editor note, and then we might use CSS to target this element and use a selector that selects elements that have a class of editor note and apply some styles to this element. So it provides some extra information that this isn't going to appear in your web document. It's not going to appear in the content of your page here. It's just extra information. Now, there's a couple of things that an attribute should have. So an attribute should have a space between it and the element name. And then it also goes on to say for an element with more than one attribute, the attribute should be separated by spaces too. So you see the element name right here as P, and then there's a space, and then your attribute. And then if you add another attribute following the string, you would have another space, and then you'd write out that attribute, all within the opening tag of this element. The attribute name followed by an equal sign, so assigning the attribute to something. And we'll talk about Boolean attributes later in this video. An attribute value wrapped with opening and closing quote marks. So an attribute within quote right here. Okay. But now moving forward into Boolean attributes, as I just alluded to, sometimes you'll see attributes written without values. This is entirely acceptable. These are called Boolean attributes. Boolean attributes can only have one value, which is generally the same as the attribute name. For example, consider the disabled attribute, which you can assign to form input elements. You would use this to disable the form element so someone couldn't make entries. So one way you could write this is for this input, you're setting the disabled attribute here equal to the string disabled. So this would make this input disabled. The user wouldn't be able to make their entries within this input. But as a shorthand, it's acceptable to write it this way, in which you have input of type text, and then you just place the disabled attribute here without assigning it a value with equal sign and then some string. And this is basically just setting disabled to true here, saying it is disabled. And then to re-enable this here, you just wouldn't place a disabled attribute at all on your input. And then in this example here, it shows these would be two disabled inputs that they're kind of grayed out, and the outline is a little bit subdued. And then this one would be an input in which you can actually have entries in. But now let's move to omitting quotes around attribute values. So if you look at code for a lot of other sites, you might come across a number of strange markup styles, including attribute values without quotes. This is permitted in certain circumstances, but it can also break your markup in other circumstances. For example, if we revisit our link example from earlier, we could write a basic version with only the href attribute like this. So here, this is an attribute, and then for this URL here, you see that it's not putting quotes. However, as soon as we add the title attribute in this way, there are problems. So this is actually going to cause an error. As written above, the browser misinterprets the markup, mistaking the title attribute for three attributes: a title attribute with a value the, and two Boolean attributes, Mozilla and homepage. So it's saying title is equal to the, and then it's thinking that we're trying to set two separate attributes here, just two Boolean attributes, Mozilla and homepage. And this goes on to recommend always include the attribute quotes. It avoids such problems and results in more readable code. So even though you can kind of get away with something like this, it's probably best to just use quotes around the values of your attributes. Now, should you use single or double quotes? So they mentioned in this article, you will notice that attributes are wrapped in double quotes. However, you might see single quotes in some HTML code. this is a matter of style. You can feel free to choose whichever one you prefer, and both are going to be equivalent. Make sure you don't mix single and double quotes, as if you did something like this example here, href equals this URL, in which you start this URL with double quotes and end it with single quotes, that's going to be an error. However, if you use one type of quote, you can include the other type of quote inside your attribute values. So here, when setting this title, isn't this fun? When using the single quote in isn't between the N and the T, that is going to be valid if we wrap our entire value here within double quotes, because it will still understand that within double quotes is our value. And this is just part of our string. But if we started this with a single quote and ended it with a single quote, well, when it hits this single quote here, it's going to think that title is equal to the value of ISN because we end it with this single quote here. And then this would be an error. And this is exactly what they show in this example here. When setting title with single quotes, isn't this fun? When placing an apostrophe in isn't here, it's going to set the value to ISN, and then T this fun is going to be set as like Boolean attributes, which is going to cause an error. So those are the fundamentals of how attributes work. They just go within your opening tags of your HTML, and they provide a little bit of extra information to a certain element that might allow you to style that element, or it might allow the browser to kind of represent that element in different ways or change the behavior of that element, like disabling the element or certain things like that. Okay. So that's kind of the mechanics of how attributes work in HTML. But next, let's move to the anatomy of an HTML document and how all this kind of fits together. In my previous videos, we covered how HTML works, what it is, how attributes work and what those are, how elements work, and kind of the mechanics of that. But now let's kind of piece it all together and talk about the anatomy of an HTML document and how it kind of all fits together. So as this says, individual HTML elements aren't very useful on their own. So let's kind of look at how all this fits together. So in this example here, this is an example of an entire HTML document. So here we have, right at the top here, doc type HTML. The doc type, when HTML was young, like 91 to 92, yes, HTML stems back that far, doc types were meant to act as links to a set of rules that the HTML page had to follow to be considered good HTML. Doc types used to look like this example right here. More recently, the doc type is a historical artifact that needs to be included for everything else to work right. Doc type HTML is the shortest string of characters that counts as a valid doc type. And they go on to say that that is all you need to know. So this needs to be included at the top of a page to kind of let the browser know that this is going to be an HTML document, but that's really all that needs to be there. You don't need really to put a bunch of stuff like this. Now, following the doc type here, we also have an HTML tag, and here it says the HTML element. This element wraps all the content on the page. It is sometimes known as the root element. So your very base element of your HTML document is going to be this HTML element that wraps everything else within your web page. And then below that, you have your head element. And the head element, so this element acts as a container for everything you want to include on the HTML page that isn't part of the content that you actually want the users to see. This includes keywords and page descriptions that should appear in search results, CSS to style content, character declarations, and more. You'll learn more about this in future videos that I will create as well. So here in this head element, you see that it doesn't wrap the body of our web page that includes content. It just wraps kind of this meta element as well as kind of the title of the page. And this title is different than like within the body of our document. This is actually going to show up like in a tab of our web page. And then you would also put like some CSS and different things like that within this head tag here. So it's a container for everything that basically the user won't really see. And then here, number 4, we have a meta tag within our head tag here, right? here. And this is an element that represents metadata that cannot be represented by other HTML elements. The charset attribute sets the character set for your document to UTF-8, which includes most characters for the vast majority of human languages. With this setting, the page can now handle any textual content it might contain. There's no reason not to set this, and it can help prevent problems later on. And then following that, we have the title element that I briefly discussed earlier. And this sets the title of the page, which is the title that appears in the browser tab that the page is loaded in. The page title is also used to describe the page when it is bookmarked. So when you have like multiple tabs open and you can see the little title of the tab, that is what this is setting. And then below our kind of head tag here, we have the body tag or the body element. And sometimes I use tags and elements synonymously here, but just remember that a tag is kind of this first, the opening, closing, and the label here. So this is a tag and this is a tag. And then when you combine the opening and closing tag and everything that's within it, that is the entire element. Okay. But sometimes I might kind of use them a little bit synonymously. But for this body element here, this contains all the content that appears on the web page, including text, images, videos, games, and whatever else you want the user to see. Okay, so you basically have the doc type at the top that tells the browser that this is going to be an HTML document. And then you have the HTML tag that is your root element that wraps everything. And then you have your header tag that is going to be a container for everything that the user doesn't really see, like setting meta tags, linking to CSS and stuff like that. And then below your head element, you have your body element that is going to include all the content that the user actually does see. But when thinking about the HTML document here, there's one other thing that's important to consider, and that is white space. And for white space, it is kind of optional, and you can see that these two examples here below are actually equivalent. So here, when we have this P element with dogs are silly, and we just have one space between dogs and are and silly, that is actually equivalent to this P element here, which it says dogs, and then it looks like you have a big tab here, and then are, and then it goes to the next line, silly, and then it closes the P tag. No matter how much white space you use inside HTML content, the HTML parser reduces each sequence of white space to a single space when rendering the code. So why use so much white space? The answer is readability. It can be easier to understand what is going on in your code if you have it nicely formatted. So that is one important consideration with HTML. It's that white space is kind of optional, and the HTML parser is automatically going to bring that white space down into just a single space when kind of rendering things out to the user. So that is kind of the anatomy of the HTML document, as well as kind of white space in HTML. But in my next videos, we'll cover the mechanics of HTML comments and then continue this HTML series from there. In today's video on my HTML series, we're going to cover HTML comments, how they work, and kind of my thought process surrounding comments here. And shout out to Mozilla Developer Network for this great article on HTML comments. So HTML has a mechanism to write comments in the code. Browsers ignore comments, effectively making comments invisible to the user. The purpose of comments is to allow you to include notes in the code to explain your logic or coding. This is very useful if you return to a code base after being away for a long time and you don't remember it. Also, comments are valuable as different people are making changes and updates. To write an HTML comment, you wrap it in the special characters, left bracket, exclamation point, hyphen, hyphen. And then to close your comment, you use hyphen, hyphen, right arrow bracket. Okay, so it looks like this example right here. They start their comment with a left arrow bracket, and then they have an exclamation point followed by two hyphens, and then their comment starts, and then they end their comment with a hyphen, hyphen, right arrow bracket. And then you can see the output of this. It doesn't show to the web page. So comments allow you to basically keep some notes in your code, but these notes don't show to the user. And The purpose of them, like it says here, is to improve kind of your maintainability and readability of your code base. If you have like some complex part of your code, you might write a comment to further explain that complex piece of code. Or if you had to kind of figure out a tricky way of doing something, you might explain that in a comment above that line of code. Now, I wouldn't get too crazy with comments. Can they absolutely help with maintainability and readability and help you kind of understand your logic and coding in the future and can help other developers understand what you wrote and stuff? 100%. But can they also make your code very dirty and make your code just overall less readable? Absolutely as well. So with your comments, make sure that they are absolutely needed. Make sure that they are always up to date. Like if you ever see a comment that is no longer relevant to your code base, just remove it right away. Also, sometimes you'll try to hide bad code with a comment. It's much better to rewrite that code in a readable way rather than just making comments. So really make sure that you need your comments and don't just use them kind of willy-nilly, so to speak, but they can be used in a useful way here and there. And this is how you do them in HTML. Today's video in my HTML series is going to cover the basics of headings and paragraphs in HTML. And shout out to Mozilla Developer Network for a great article on this. So this goes on to say that most structured texts consist of headings and paragraphs, whether you're reading a story, newspaper, textbook, magazine, etc. Structured content makes the reading experience easier and more enjoyable. In HTML, each paragraph has to be wrapped in a P element, like so. And then you can see this example here. They have an opening and closing P tag here. Here's the closing, here's the opening, and within that is your content. So this is how you would signify that you want a paragraph in your HTML. And similarly, each header needs to be wrapped in a heading element. So this is an opening H1 tag and a closing H1 tag, and this is your content in between. This would be a header right here. And for headers, there are 6 heading elements. You have H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, and H6. Each element represents a different level of content in the document. H1 represents the main heading. So this is like your top level, most important heading in your document. H1, it's like the big dog of your document. H2 represents subheadings. And then H3 represents subheadings, and so on and so forth. And this allows you to kind of create a structural hierarchy. For example, in this story that I'm going to show you below here, the H1 element represents the title of the story. The H2 elements represent the title of each chapter of the story. And the H3 elements represent subsections of each chapter. So you can see here, if you had a web page and you're kind of telling a story or something, the main header, the title of the story, would be your H1 right at the top. And usually a web page is probably only going to have one H1, or that is a common way to structure things. And then here, the author's name, it's not necessarily a heading, so they just use a paragraph text here. And then they have a chapter right here, and they wrap it with an H2. So this is kind of a subheading. Not quite as important as the main title, but still pretty important. Then they have a paragraph here, another H2 because it's another chapter title. So they do a good job of keeping it consistent. All chapter titles have these H2 headings here. Then they have some more text in a paragraph here. And then they have a subsection in which they wrap it in H3. So most important is the title. Second most important is the chapters. And then third most important is the subsections. And they create this structural hierarchy using these different kind of H1, H2, H3, these different levels to these headers here. And then it goes on to say, it's really up to you what the elements involved represent, as long as the hierarchy makes sense. You just need to bear in mind a few best practices as you create such structures within kind of your HTML. So for one, preferably, you should use a single H1 per page. This is the top level heading, and all other things sit below this hierarchy. So this is kind of what I explained earlier. Most of the time, you're just going to have that one single top level H1 on your web page. Number 2, make sure you use headings in the correct order in the hierarchy. Don't use H3 elements to represent subheadings, followed by H2 elements to represent subheadings. That doesn't make sense and will lead to weird results. And then number 3, of the 6 heading levels available, you should aim to use no more than 3 per page, unless you feel it is necessary. Documents with many levels, for example, a deep heading hierarchy, become unwieldy and difficult to navigate. On such occasions, it is advisable to spread the content over multiple pages if possible. So don't get too crazy with your hierarchy in which you're using a bunch of different like nested structures and stuff like that. And you might be thinking like, why do we need to structure? Well, they go on to kind of show an example here. And in this example, they don't use a structure. And you see when it gets rendered to the web page, it's just this one big chunk of text here. There's no like this is not super readable. It's just this one long piece of text. And they go on to say this is because there are no elements to give the content structure. So the browser doesn't know what is a heading and what is a paragraph. Furthermore, users looking at a web page tend to scan quickly to find relevant content, just reading headings to begin with. If they can't see anything useful, they'll go somewhere else. So if I go to a page and I just saw one long block of text like this, I'm probably bouncing because I just see a bunch of text that's going to take me a long time to parse. And I'm going to move on with my life. And then here, search engines indexing your page consider the contents of headings as important keywords for influencing the page's search rankings. Without headings, your page will perform poorly in terms of search engine optimization. So if you type some keywords into Google, it's going to use web pages that have headings that are relevant to those search keywords. So if you don't use headings, then Google can't really scrape your web page and know if you have relevant keywords to whatever is being searched. So it becomes way less likely that if someone searches for something on Google, that your page will actually come up because it can't scrape your headings here. Also, severely impaired people often don't read web pages, they listen to them instead. This is done with software called a screen reader. And effectively, if you don't use headings, it makes this much more difficult for these individuals to understand what's going on with your web page because the screen reader will use your headings and use this information to read things out in a more clear way to this individual. Also, to style content with CSS or to do some interesting things with JavaScript, you need to have your elements wrapped in relevant content. So CSS and JavaScript can effectively target it. So creating a consistent structure will allow you to use something like CSS to select all of your H3 elements, and maybe you want those in like a slightly different font style compared to your H1 elements. Well, if you consistently wrap all of your kind of subheaders within H3, then you can style those by just using one single selector, and it makes things so much easier rather than wrapping some of your subheadings in like an H6, some of them in an H4, so on and so forth. Therefore, having a structure to the markup is a really good idea. And then this goes into, why do we need semantics? Well, semantics are relied on everywhere around us. We rely on previous experience to tell us what the function of everyday object is. When we see something, we know what the function should be. For example, we expect a red traffic light to mean stop and a green traffic light to mean go. Things can get very tricky if there's a wrong application of semantics, like if red traffic lights meant go. In a similar way, we need to make sure we are using correct elements, giving our content the correct meaning, function, or appearance. In this context, the H1 element is also a semantic element, which give the text it wraps around the role or meaning of a top-level heading of the page, or a more important heading on our page. The browser will give this a large font size and make it look like a heading, although you can style it however you want using CSS. So the browser will kind of give your different heading levels different default styles, but don't worry if you don't want to use those styles, you can overwrite that using like an H1 selector or a different selector in CSS and add some custom styles. More importantly, its semantic value will be used in multiple ways. For example, by search engines and screen readers, as we kind of discussed before. On the other hand, you can make any element look like a top-level heading. Consider the following. This is a span element. It has no semantics. You just wrap it in content when you want to apply CSS to it without giving it any extra meaning. They've applied some styles to it, but it has no semantic value, and it will not get any of the benefits of search engine optimization or helping people with screen readers or different things like that. So it's a good idea to use the relevant HTML element for the job. So if you find yourself doing a bunch of stuff like this, like you have text and you're just wrapping it in a span element and you're customizing it that way, it's probably not the best idea. And it's probably much better to use something more semantic, like a paragraph tag or a H4 element or something like that. Okay. So those are the fundamentals of headings and paragraphs. In my next video, we will move on to lists and other HTML concepts. Today, you're going to learn everything you need to know about lists in HTML. And I'm going to use Mozilla Developer Network's article on lists to kind of use the supplementary material here. But lists are kind of everywhere in life, from your shopping list to the list of directions you subconsciously follow to get to your house every day, to the list of instructions you are following to these tutorials. They are everywhere in the web as well. So lists are definitely important to know. And when it comes to HTML, you kind of have two main types of lists. You have unordered and ordered lists. So for unordered lists here, they're used to mark up lists of items for which the order of the items doesn't really matter. And an example of this is something like a shopping list. You have milk, eggs, bread, hummus. Definitely not on my shopping list, but there's no like real order to these. You don't really care whether you pick up the eggs or the milk or the bread first. You just care that you get all these when you go grocery shopping. So this is an example of an unordered list. And to create this unordered list, you would wrap these list items in a UL element or an unordered list element. And this is going to be your container element for your unordered list. And then as it says here, the last step is to wrap each list item in an LI element or a list item element. So here you can see you have your container here, which basically tells the browser that I'm going to create an unordered list here. And then all of your list items still go within these LI tags, and this creates an unordered list of these 4 different list items, and your browser output will look like this right here. Now you also have ordered lists, and these are items in which the order does matter. So if you take a set of directions as an example, the order you do those directions matters, like drive to the end of the road, turn right, go straight. If you first went straight and then you turned right and then you drove to the end of the road, you'd probably end up in a completely different destination. So the order does matter. And to make an ordered list, instead of wrapping everything in a UL, you're actually going to wrap everything in an OL, standing for ordered list. So here, when I want to create this ordered list, I use an OL element here. So opening and closing tags, and this is going to be the container for my ordered list. And then for every item within my ordered list, I still wrap that in a list item element. So here I have my ordered list as my container, and then every item within this ordered list is going to be wrapped in an LI. So the only difference between an ordered list and an unordered list here is that an unordered list, it's going to have a UL as a container, but it's going to have the same LI elements. And then an ordered list is going to have an OL as a container, standing for ordered list, but you're still wrapping all of your items within list item elements. Now, you can also nest lists or have lists within lists. And it mentions here it's perfectly okay to have a list within a list. You might want to have some sub bullets sitting below a top level bullet. And take an example of a recipe earlier. If you have an ordered list container here, you might have several different list items within it, but within those list items, you might have kind of sub lists. And this goes on to say, since the last two bullets are very closely related to the one before them, it might make sense to nest them inside their own unordered list and put that list inside the current fourth bullet. So what that would look like is we have our overall ordered list, and then we have our first three list items here. And then for our fourth list item, it gets a little bit more complex here, in which we have our LI, our opening tag, and then we have process all the ingredients into a paste. And then before we close this list item, we open up an unordered list container, and then we have two more LIs within that unordered list container. And then we close our unordered list, and then we close our LI here. And then we close our overall OL. So we have our main container, our kind of root container OL here, three list items, but then in the fourth list item, before we close that list item, if we want to have a list within a list here, we open up another container element. In this case, it's a UL, unordered list, but it could be an OL as well. And then we put our list items within this. We close our nested list, and then we close our list item, and then we close our kind of outermost list. So this is how you could create a sub list within an overall list in HTML. And really, that's all you need to know about lists within HTML. In my next video, we'll cover emphasis and importance in HTML. Today, we're going to cover everything you need to know regarding emphasis and importance in HTML. And I'm going to use MDN as a nice resource to go through this video with you. So in the human language, we often emphasize certain words to alter the meaning of a sentence. And we often want to mark certain words as important or different in some way. HTML provides various semantic elements to allow us to mark up textual content with such effects. And in this section, we'll look at a few of the most common ones. So first off, emphasis. When we want to add emphasis to the spoken language, we stress certain words, as I did there, subtly altering the meaning of what we are saying. Similarly, in written language, we tend to stress words by putting them in italics. For example, the following two sentences have different meanings. I'm glad you weren't late. Or, I am glad you weren't late. The first sentence sounds genuine and relieved that the person wasn't late. In contrast, the second sentence with the words glad and late in italics sounds sarcastic or even passive aggressive, expressing annoyance that the person arrived a bit late. In HTML, we use the EM element to mark such instances, as well as making the document more interesting to read. These are recognized by screen readers, which can be configured to speak them in a different tone of voice. Browsers style this as italic by default, but you shouldn't use this tag purely to get italic styling. To do that, you could use a span element and some CSS, or perhaps even an I element that we will later get to below. So if we wanted to create the sentence in HTML, I am glad you weren't late, we would still wrap it all in a P tag. So I'm glad you weren't late would all be in a P tag. But wrapping around glad and late, we would wrap that with an EM element, an opening EM tag and a closing EM tag before glad, and the same thing before late. And this will add that emphasis around glad and late. And as I mentioned, this is important for screen readers, and it will also provide a default style of italic to glad and late. Now, similarly, to emphasize important words, we tend to stress them in the spoken language and bold them in written language. For example, this liquid is highly toxic. I'm counting on you. Do not be late. In HTML, we use the strong element to mark up such instances, as well as making the document more useful. Again, these are recognized by screen readers, which can be configured to speak them in a different tone of voice. Browsers styles as bold text by default, but you shouldn't rely on this purely. To do that, you could use a span with some CSS or the B element, as we'll go over below. So the way that you could do this to add this kind of strong emphasis here is everything could still be wrapped in a P tag or a heading tag or whatever it might be. But then to make those words stand out, you would wrap them in a strong element. So here, this liquid is, and then we open up a strong element, highly toxic as our text, and then we close our strong element. So highly toxic here is going to be in that more bold, kind of strong font here. And then in the second line, we do the same thing, but wrap that around do not. And then you can also nest strong and emphasis inside of one another if desired. So here, if you drink it as just normal text, and then they open up a strong tag, they type you may, and then they also use an emphasis tag, wrap that around the text die, and then close the strong tag. So you may die is really emphasized here because they wrap the EM around die and then the entire strong tag around you may die. So wrapping these around each other is totally valid to do. Okay. Now, as we alluded to earlier, you do have elements for italicizing things, bolding things, and underlining things. So the elements we've discussed so far have associated semantics. The situation with B, I, and U, bold, italic, and underline, is somewhat more complicated. They came about so people could write bold, italics, or underlined text in an area when CSS was still supported poorly or not at all. Elements like this, which only affect the kind of styles of text and not the semantics, are known as presentational elements and should no longer be used because, as we've seen, semantics is important for accessibility, SEO, etc. HTML redefined B, I, and U with new, somewhat confusing semantic roles. Here's the best rule you can remember. It's only appropriate to use B, I, or U to convey a meaning traditionally conveyed with bold, italics, or underline when there isn't a more suitable element, and there usually is. Consider whether using strong, EM, mark, or span might be more appropriate. Always keep an accessible mindset. The concept of italics isn't very helpful to people using screen readers or to people using a writing system other than the Latin alphabet. I is used to convey a meaning traditionally conveyed by italic, foreign words, taxonomy, designation, technical terms, a thought. B is used to convey a meaning that would be conveyed in bold, keywords, product names, lead sentence. U is used to convey a meaning traditionally conveyed by underline, proper name, misspelling, etc. Okay, so for the most part, it's probably a good idea to steer clear of I, B, and U and use strong, EM, and mark instead, as those are going to be more semantic and less just kind of like presentational, and it's better to do that presentational stuff in CSS, but there might be a time and place for these here and there, okay? So that is everything you need to know about emphasis and importance within HTML. In today's video, you're going to learn everything you need to know about hyperlinks in HTML and how to link between pages within a page and how kind of a hyperlink works, a quick primer on URLs, some best practices, how you can actually link to email somebody. If that doesn't make sense, it'll make more sense once we get to it, and all that sort of stuff. So everything you need to know about hyperlinks on the web. So first off, we're going to use the Mozilla Developer Network web docs here. I find it to be a great resource, and they have a great article on this. So for this, they mentioned hyperlinks are really important. They are what makes the web a web. And what they mean by that is the web allows you to link to a bunch of different places and is a hub for all these resources on the internet. And without that ability to link from one resource to another resource or one website to another website, it really wouldn't be a web of these resources. So links allow this. And this article kind of shows you how they work. So what is a hyperlink? Well, hyperlinks are one of the most exciting innovations the web has to offer, if you find this sort of thing exciting. And they've been a feature of the web since the beginning and are what makes the web a web, as I just mentioned. Hyperlinks allow us to link documents to other documents or resources, link to specific parts of documents, or make apps available at a web address. Almost any web content can be converted to a link so that when clicked or otherwise activated, the web browser goes to another web address or URL. Note, a URL can point to HTML files, text files, images, text documents, videos, audios, or anything else that lives on the web. If the browser doesn't know how to display or handle that file, it will ask you if you want to open the file or download the file. And then it goes on. For example, the BBC homepage contains many links that point not only to multiple news stories, but also different areas of the website itself. Login, registration, other tools, and more. And as you can see on this example website here, you can go to like this news tab, this sport tab, this weather tab. All of these are links within this individual website. So it's not just linking from website to website, but it's linking from within websites. And you can also link on a certain page in which, if you're at the top of the page, you could click a link and it'll automatically scroll you to the bottom of the page. And we'll show you how that works here a little bit later on. So when looking at the anatomy of the link, a basic link is created by wrapping the text or other content inside an A element and using the href attribute, also known as a hypertext reference or target that contains the web address. So to create a link, you wrap this A element around the text that you want to be like the clickable part of your link. You would click on this text here, and then you set this href attribute to the URL that contains the web address of where you want to navigate to. So this example here, this p tag, and then I'm creating a link to, and then wrapping the Mozilla homepage in a tag here with an href set to mozilla.org. This is going to take us to the Mozilla homepage. This is the link that's created with this HTML. So if I click on this here, you see that it navigates me to the Mozilla homepage here. Now you can also add supporting information with the title attribute. So you may want to add a title attribute. The title contains additional information about the link, such as what kind of information the page includes or things to be aware of on the website. So here they have the same A tag here wrapping the text that they want to link to, and they have their href here as normal, but now they set a title. And the title is the best place to find more information about Mozilla's mission and how to contribute. And it says this gives us the following result, and hovering over the link displays the title as a tooltip. So if I hover over it here, what you're going to see is a little tooltip that says the best place to find more information about Mozilla's mission and how to contribute. So it shows kind of the title within this tooltip here. So kind of a neat little feature of links, which I don't think a ton of people actually take advantage of or actually use. Now here they note that a link title is only revealed on mouse over, which means that people relying on keyboard controls or screen touches to navigate web pages will have difficulty accessing the title information. If it's truly important, then you should present it in a manner that will be accessible to all users. Now you can make almost any content into a link, even block level elements. If you have an image you want to make into a link, use the A element and reference the image file with the image element. So here, to make this image right here a link, all we have to do is wrap it in this A tag. And then we give it an href, and then when we click on this image, it's going to take us to wherever this href points to on the web. Okay, now just for a quick primer on URLs and paths, they mention that to fully understand link targets, you need to understand URLs and file paths. And they mention a URL, or Uniform Resource Locator, is a string of text that defines where something is located on the web. For example, Mozilla's English homepage is located at this URL here. And then URLs use paths to find files. Paths specify where the file you're interested in is located in the file system. So when you use this URL here, you are literally accessing a file path on a certain computer or a certain server. And depending on that path, it will depend on what file you serve to your web browser. So they say for an example directory structure, you can see that this directory right here. And they say the root of the directory is called creating hyperlinks. When working locally with a website, you'll have one directory that contains the entire site inside the root. We have an index.html file and a context.html file. In a real website, index.html will be our homepage or landing page. There are also two directories inside our root, PDFs and projects. So two different folders within our root directory there. They each have a single file inside of them, a PDF and index.html file. Note that you can have two index.html files in one project as long as they're in different locations. The second index.html would perhaps be the main landing page for project-related information. So same directory. If you want to include a hyperlink inside index.html pointing to context.html, you would specify the file name that you want to link to because it's in the same directory as the current file. The URL would use context.html. So since it's in the root directory here and we don't have to navigate through the file system at all, it's already in the root directory, we can just use an href equal to context.html. Now, if you need to move down subdirectories and you want to include a hyperlink inside index.html pointing to projects/index.html, you would need to go down into the projects directory before indicating the file you want to link. This is done by specifying the directory's name, then a /, then a name of the file. The URL you would use is projects/index.html. If we wanted to go into our projects directory and then access our index.html file and serve that page, we would use an href of projects/index.html. Now, if we're in our root directory and we need to move back directories and we want to include a hyperlink inside projects/index.html pointing to PDFs/project-brief.pdf, you would have to go up a directory level, then go back down into the PDFs directory. To go up a directory, you use two dots. So the URL that you would use would be /PDFs/projects-brief.pdf. And then to note, you can combine multiple instances of these features into complex URLs if needed. For example, .. / .. so on and so forth. Okay, so brief primer there on URLs just to give you a better understanding of kind of how this all fits together. Now, they mentioned document fragments here. So it's possible to link to a specific part of the HTML document known as a document fragment. Rather than just to the top of the document, to do this, you have to first assign an ID attribute to the element you want to link to. It normally makes sense to link to specific headings. So this would look something like the following. We might have a heading that we set an ID called mailing address. And then if we want to link to this specific part of the page, we can use that ID within our href. So the way that we can do this is to link to a specific ID, you'd include it at the end of a URL, preceded by a hash or pound symbol. For example, to link to this mailing address ID, to link to this specific part of the page here, we could use context.html, the URL, and then a hashtag mailing address. And when we click on this URL, it will take us to the context.html page, but then link to this specific H2 here. So we can link to different IDs that we have on our page using that # symbol. And it says you can even use the document fragment reference on its own to link to another part of the current page. So if you want to just link within a page, say I'm at the top part of this page and I want to link to this document fragments hash here, like what I just did there, clicking on document fragments here, see how it moves it to the top of the page? If I want to do that within a page, then I don't need the first URL here. I can just set my href to whatever ID I want to link to. And that's going to tell your browser, hey, I want to navigate to this current page, but whatever element has this ID of mailing address. Now for absolute versus relative URLs, an absolute URL points to a location defined by its absolute location on the web, including its protocol and domain name. So this would include https://www.example.com and then /projects/index.html. This would be the kind of entire URL here. This is the absolute URL. But a relative URL points to a location that is relative to the file you are linking from, more like what we've kind of looked at in previous examples. For example, if we wanted to link from an example file at https://example.com to a PDF file in the same directory, the URL would just be the file name project-brief.pdf because this is a relative link. Okay, so those are absolute and relative URLs. And then for some best practices regarding links, it mentions use clear link wording. It's easy to throw links up on your page. That's not enough. We need to make our links accessible to all readers, regardless of their context. So for example, screen reader users like jumping around the page from link to link and reading links out of context. Search engines use link text to index target files. So it is a good idea to include keywords in your link text to effectively describe what will be linked to. Visual readers skim over the page rather than reading every word, and their eyes will be drawn to page features that stand out like links. So make sure that you use descriptive links. Okay. And then so for some other tips, don't repeat the URL as part of the link text. URLs look ugly and sound even uglier when a screen reader reads them out letter by letter. Don't say link or links in the link text. It's just noise. Screen readers tell people there's a link. Visual readers also know that it's a link because links are generally styled in a different color and underlined. Keep your link text as short as possible. This is helpful because screen readers need to interpret the entire link text. Minimize instances where multiple copies of the same link are linked to different places. This can cause problems for screen reader users. If there's a list of links out of context that are labeled click here, click here, click here. And then it also says use the download attribute when linking to a download. So when you are linking to a resource that's to be downloaded rather than open in the browser, you can use the download attribute to provide a default save file name. Here's an example of the download link to the latest Windows version of Firefox. So if you set the download is equal to Firefox latest 64-bit installer.exe, that's going to be the file name that this is downloaded as. So that can be a nice thing to do for linking to something that's going to download. All right. But now let's move to email links here. So it's possible to create links or buttons that, when linked, open a new outgoing email message rather than linking to a resource or page. This is done by using an A element with the mail to URL scheme. So it's not a mail to attribute, it's a mail to URL scheme. In its most basic and commonly used form, a mail to link indicates an email address of the intended recipient. For example, they have this link right here, and they set the href is equal to mail to : and then an email that you would want to send to. So they set the email as nowhere@mozilla.org. And then they say this results in a link that looks like this: send email to nowhere. And they say, in fact, the email address is optional if you omit it and your href is mail to. A new outgoing email window will be opened by the user's email client with no destination address. This is often useful as share links that users can click on to send an email to an address of their choosing. So if you set an href that has a mail to prepended to it here, it's going to open the user's email and get them ready to set an email. And if you want to set it to a specific email, you can set that after the colon here. And then if you just want it to open their email, you could just set this to mail to. And if I click on this, it would open my main email right now. And on top of that, you can also set like the CC, the body, the subject, and all of these in your kind of mail to attribute to where you can set the email, and then you can follow that with a question mark. So mail to this email, and then followed by a question mark. It means you're going to add basically more kind of attributes to this. And then you're going to set the CC is equal to name2@rabbitables.com. And then you're going to set another with an and sign here. It's going to say, I'm going to set another kind of href attribute right now. And then you set the BCC, and then another and signed. You can set the subject and another and signed here. And then you can set the body. So you could kind of pre-fill all these things for the email if you would like. So that is everything you need to know about hyperlinks for the web. I know it's quite a bit here, but I think this will be very helpful information for you to know when you're working as a web developer. In today's video of my HTML series, we're going to cover document and website structure. And in particular, we're going to cover like the basic sections of a document, HTML for structuring the content. So like using different HTML elements to structure your content across the page, how you would kind of plan out a simple website and different things like that. And this could be particularly helpful if you're like, okay, I want to build this website, but I don't even really know where to start. Well, there's kind of some core sections of websites that you tend to use. And by just using some HTML and structuring this website, it might help you kind of fill the rest in and provide you kind of a nice starting place. Okay. So let's use this Mozilla Developer Network article to dive in to kind of the basic sections of a document first. So number one is going to be the header. And the header is usually a big strip across the top with a big heading, logo, or perhaps a tagline. This usually stays the same from one page to another. And then you also have a navigation bar. This will link to a website's main sections. So this might be a menu button or some different links or tabs. Like the header, this content usually remains consistent from one page to another. Having inconsistent navigation on your website will just lead to confusion, frustrating users, and just leading to an overall poor user experience. Many web designers consider the navigation bar to be part of the header rather than an individual component, but that's not a requirement. In fact, some also argue that having the two separate is better for accessibility reasons, as screen readers can read the two features better if they are separate. Okay, so you have your header and navigation bar, and sometimes these are kind of combined together. And then you also have your main content. So a big area in the center that contains most of the unique content of a given web page. And I'll show examples of these in just a few minutes here. For example, if the user has a video they want to watch, so say you're on YouTube, the video is going to be like the big main center part of your web page there. Or if you're reading a blog, it could be the main story. And it mentions that this is one page that will definitely vary from page to page, or one section that will vary from page to page, because depending on what part of the page, like the content of that page is of course going to change. And then you may also have a sidebar. So this could be some peripheral information. So it's not kind of your main content. It's like off to the side a bit, hence sidebar. So for this, it might be info, links, quotes, ads. Usually this is contextual to what is contained in the main content. And there are also some cases where some recurrent elements like a secondary navigation system. So you might have a side navigation bar. And then you may also have a footer. So it's a strip across the bottom of the page that generally contains some of the fine print, any copyright notices, or some contact information. It's a place to put common information like the header, but usually that information is not critical or secondary to the website itself. The footer is also sometimes used for SEO purposes by providing links for quick access for popular content. So here's an example of a typical website. So up here at the top, you might see your header. This is like the main title of the website. If it was my website, it might be like Code Ryan right at the top. And then right here, you can see this is going to be the navigation bar. So someone could click on home, our team, projects, or contact and navigate to different pages. This is going to be your main content here. And then over on the right is going to be a sidebar. And then you're going to have the footer here at the bottom. Now, HTML gives you some different elements for structuring this content. And as this mentions here, it says the example above, it isn't pretty, but it is perfectly fine for illustration purposes of these kind of main sections. We need to use and respect semantics to use the right element for the right job to lay out these different sections. And this is because visuals don't tell the whole story. We use color and font size to draw sighted users' attention to most useful parts of the content, like the navigation menu and related links. But what about visually impaired people who might not understand concepts of like pink or large font? Well, in your HTML code, you can mark up sections of content based on their functionality. You can use elements that represent the sections of content described above unambiguously, and assistive technologies like screen readers can recognize those elements and help with tasks like find the main navigation, find the main content. And it says to implement such semantic markup, HTML provides dedicated tags that you can use to represent such sections. For example, you have a header element, a nav element, as you can see here. You have a main element, as well as within that main, you might use different article or section elements to kind of break this up, as well as div elements. And then you can use an aside for a sidebar, which is often placed within a main element. And then you also have a footer element as well. So to go in a little bit more detail for these, the main element is for content that is unique to the current page. It says use the main element only once per page and put it directly inside the body element. Ideally, this shouldn't be nested within other elements. And then for the article element, it encloses a block of related content that makes sense on its own without the rest of the page. For example, a single blog post. And then for a section element, it's similar to the article, but it is more for grouping together a single part of the page that constitutes one single page or functionality, like a mini map or a set of article headlines and summaries, or a theme. It's considered best practice to begin each section with a header. Also note that you can break articles up into different sections or sections up into different articles, depending on the context. So an article should be like a standalone independent piece of content. You don't really need more context to understand an article or the content within an article. But for a section here, as it says, it's more for grouping together kind of parts of a page. Now you also have the aside element, and this contains content that is not directly related to the main content, but can provide additional information indirectly related to it. And we also have your header element, and it represents a group of introductory content. If it is a child of the body, it defines the global header of the web page. But if it's a child of an article or a section, it defines a specific header for that section or article. And it mentions try not to confuse this with titles and headings. So you might have a header element within an article. So it's going to be kind of your introductory content of your article, but this might include like an H2 element within it. Okay. And you also have the navigation element, and this just contains the main navigation functionality for your web page. And then the footer represents the group of end content for a page. Now you also have non-semantic wrappers. So sometimes you'll come across situations where you can't find an ideal semantic element to group some items together or to wrap some content. Sometimes you might want to just group a set of elements together to affect them all in a single entity with some CSS or JavaScript. For cases like these, HTML provides div and span elements. You should use these preferably with a suitable class attribute to provide some kind of label for them so they can be easily targeted. Span elements are inline, non-semantic elements, which you should use only if you can't think of a better semantic text element to wrap your content. And then a div element is going to be a block level non-semantic element. So a div is going to take up an entire line on your web page, and all content next to it is going to go to the next line. A span is going to be an inline element. It's not going to take up an entire line, and it's going to go kind of within a line. Okay, hence inline element. And it mentions that you should also only use a div when you can't use a more semantic element like an article, a section, or something like that. Now you also have line breaks and horizontal rules. So for these, it mentions that two elements that you might occasionally want to use are the BR and HR element. So the BR element, the line break element, creates a line break in a paragraph. It is the only way to force a rigid structure in a situation where you want a series of fixed short lines. So in this example here, they're saying this is a poem, and if you want to add a line break after each line right here, well, you need to use this BR element, because without this element, HTML is just going to close that white space together and just put a normal space between this and not add a break. Okay, so you can use the BR here to make sure that this gets broken onto a new line. So you can see after Odell here, we have this BR. So it tells your browser to display the kind of next piece of content on the next line. And then same thing right after HTML here, right after HTML here, it breaks onto another line because we have this BR element here. Now you can do a very similar thing with the HR element, but with these, they create a horizontal rule and then document that denotes a thematic change in the text. So for example, you might have a paragraph and then you might use an HR element and then you might have another paragraph following that. And what that would look like on your page is your first paragraph, and then you would have a horizontal line going all the way across your page, and then your next paragraph. So this is ways to kind of break up your text with a horizontal line here. So those are kind of the basic fundamentals of breaking up your website into a semantic structure in which you have like a main header, a navigation bar, a sidebar, your main content, and then you might have different sections within this content, and it might be all within this article of text, as well as a footer down here. All of these are nice kind of semantic ways to structure your website. And then you can also use BR tags to add specific breaks in your content and move things to the next line. And then also you can use HRs to add kind of horizontal lines in your content as well. So hopefully that gives you a good idea on how to semantically structure your web page, and I'll see you in that next one. Today, you're going to learn about a new HTML element that is going to probably make your life as a developer quite a bit easier, as I know I use stuff like this all the time. So what am I talking about here? Well, I'm talking about the new dialog element in HTML that is going to allow you to create things like modals and like subpages, even have form pop-ups and stuff like that. So if we look at the Mozilla Developer Network docs here, we see this kind of example of using this. So if I click show dialog, you see that we get this little kind of dialog, this little pop-up in which it kind of is this subpage within our overall page. And it kind of gives the background of this page, this gray kind of outline, and it's just kind of this pop-up for our page. And this could be a form, it could be a select box like what they have here, and then I cancel it and it goes back to our other page. All right, so HTML now has this built in with a dialog component, as you can see right here. And within this dialog component, there's a few different ways that you can use this. And towards the end of this video, I will show you an example of creating a React component with this dialog. So creating your own custom dialog and just using this HTML for it and not having to pull in some external library like Material UI or something like that. Now, could you still do that? Absolutely. And in my day-to-day career, we still use like Material UI for our dialogs and stuff, but you can now do it just natively within HTML. And I generally think that that's probably a good thing to do. So when using this dialog, it gives you a couple of methods kind of right out of the box to close or open the dialog. So for the dialog element, you can call the show modal or show methods on this element to have the dialog kind of pop up and to actually show it. And for this modal, you can also call the close method, and that will close the dialog. And in addition to that, it also has an open property, which will indicate whether the dialog should be open or closed. So there's multiple ways to do it. You can either call the show or show modal methods, or you can use the open attribute to dictate whether the dialog is open or closed or not. And you can also use the close method to close the dialog. Now, another kind of note with this, or a couple of notes with this, is that form elements, they can close a dialog if they have the attribute of method is equal to dialog. So if you have a form element and you set the method attribute of that form element to dialog, then as soon as you submit that form, it's going to close the dialog. So you can also use dialogs with forms pretty seamlessly, which is quite nice. And then in addition to this, you know how you see how the gray behind this example, so when we show the dialog here, it kind of grays the background here. Well, you can kind of change that behavior, that default behavior, with the backdrop property or the backdrop pseudo element here. So if I can find where I was just at, so right here, The backdrop CSS pseudo element can be used to style the backdrop that is displayed behind a dialog element when the dialog is displayed with the show modal property. Okay, so you can kind of dim the background of your dialog with this backdrop CSS pseudo element. Okay, so that's kind of an overview of this element and how to use it, but let's actually head on over to VS Code here. And what I've done is I just did npx create your React app, just a very basic React app. And now let's show you how you can actually create a React component. And I'm gonna kind of do this live here, and hopefully I don't mess up how to use this dialog component. So first off, I'm going to, and I was about to type yarn start because we use that in our kind of day-to-day application. So I'm used to using that, but I don't have that installed. So we're just going to npm start here. And as you can see, I just have a blank page to where I say, this is my app. And if I go back to my code editor, that's because in my app.js, I just render out, this is my app. Okay, so we are going to close this. And now what I'm going to do is create a dialog component. So in my src folder, you could create a additional folder called components and stuff like that if you wanted to have maybe a better structure of your app. I'm not going to worry about that right now because I'm just creating a single component for a dialog to see or to show a couple of different ways to use this. So I'm just going to do a new file here, and I'm going to do dialog.jsx. And all I'm going to do here is create a dialog component. So export default, if I could type today, that would be great. Function. And as you can see, I'm using, I think I'm using GitHub Copilot right now. So it's giving me some autocomplete suggestions and stuff. I'm going to try not to use that for the sake of illustration here. I'll have definitely future videos to come on my experience with Amazon Code Whisperer, Copilot, Tab 9. I've kind of used all of them, and I have some thoughts, but we'll talk about that in future videos. So I'm going to have this function that is just a dialog function. And what am I going to return? Well, I'm going to just return for now just a dialog. So I'm going to go dialog. And within this dialog, I'm just going to say, this is my dialog. And then within my dialog, I think I'm going to add probably a close button to just close this dialog. And then within this dialog component, I'm also going to include a button to open my dialog. So let's actually do a React fragment here, move the dialog within this fragment, because when we return JSX within a React component, you can only return one top level element. So I'm doing that here. I don't have prettier setup in this application. So on save, it doesn't automatically format, which I would definitely recommend, but I think we'll be fine for this kind of demo here. And I'm going to just have an open button here. So I have my dialog here, and I'm going to now render this within my app.js. So under this is my app, I'm going to just go with dialog. And I'm going to render this out here. So if I go back to my app, you see that I just have a button here with open. Now, why is this? Because my dialog is not open right now. So I don't actually see the content of my dialog. I don't see this is my dialog and my close button, because by default, this is a closed dialog. So how can we actually open and close this dialog? So let's first use the kind of show modal and close methods of this dialog. So I'm going to do this by creating a ref, and I'm going to just say dialog ref. It's going to equal use ref. And I'm going to need to import use ref from React here. So let's import, if I could type, use ref from React. So I'm going to import that here. And then on my dialog element, I'm going to set my ref is equal to dialog ref. Okay, so now I have access to my dialog element, which is going to allow me to call the close and show modal methods of this element. So I'm going to say function open dialog. And what am I going to do? Well, I'm going to call dialog ref dot current dot show modal. So this is going to open my dialog element because I'm going to access on this ref here. The current property of this ref is going to be my dialog element. So then I'm going to call the show modal method on it. And now I'm going to have a close dialog function. So here, and I believe I'm using the theme of winter is coming, just in case you are wondering. And I'm going to call the close method here. And now within my close button, I'm going to do on click, and it's just going to be my close dialog function. And then for my open button, I'm going to say on click is equal to open dialog. All right. So that was quite a bit of coding there. I definitely probably messed something up, but let's go back to my app and see if I can indeed open and close my dialog. So I click open, and then you can see this is my dialog, and then I close it and it closes my dialog. So surprisingly enough, I didn't mess anything up. So now let's actually play around with this backdrop a little bit. Instead of making it gray, let's do something, I don't know, more interesting. I actually would probably keep it gray in an actual app, but let's show you what it's like to change this. So first off, go into my dialog. How about I just add a class to it equal to dialog. So that will be easier for me to style my dialog here. So I'm going to go to index.css. Oh, and within my overall app, I used display grid and placed my items to my center, which is why you see that this stuff is like centered within my page here. But moving back to my dialog here, so I can access the dialog class, and then I need to use the pseudo element of backdrop, I believe, which is right there. And then for this, I'm going to set my background color. What do you think? Let's do like RGBA. So red, green, blue, alpha. So because I don't want my transparency to be like 100%, I want to make sure it is transparent. I just said that incorrectly. I don't want my opacity to be 100%. I want to make sure it has some transparency. I think that's the correct way to say that. You'll understand what I mean. So let's, I don't know. I forget how this works. So that's all red. So we're just going to make it partially red here. So red and then 0, 0. And then let's do, 0.5. That sounds great. So if this works, when I go back to here and I open this, you're going to see that now my backdrop has this like partially red backdrop with an opacity set to it. So you can still see like this is my app and my open button here. So it's still kind of see-through. That's the word I was going for. And that's how you can change your backdrop there. So, I could also add some, maybe I'll add some blue to it and we'll see what that does to the color. It makes it purple. I'm not good at like color science stuff. So cool. So now we have like a purple backdrop. So you can see that can change it to some degree there. So that's how you can adjust the backdrop and play around with that. But let me show you one other way to kind of handle this within React. So instead of calling the show modal and close methods here, let's actually use some state and then set the open property of this dialog to that state. So let's go back here and say const show and set show is equal to use state, and then we'll initialize it to false. And then I need to import use state here. So I will, and I no longer need this ref. And I'm going to now set my show for my, no, wait, was it show? I think it's actually my open property of my dialog. I'm going to set that to my show piece of state. So if show is true here, it should open my dialog. And if show is false, it's going to keep my dialog closed. Okay. But now in my functions, my open dialog, I should set show, and I should set that to true to open my dialog. And then for my closed dialog, I should set show to false here. So I'm going to do that there. And I think that's the only updates I need here. So if I go back and now I click on open and close, you see that I now open and close my dialog here. But do you notice one thing here? I don't actually get my backdrop styles anymore when I open and close my dialog. Although I still have like my CSS here of my dialog backdrop, and I still have my CSS property. So what's going on here? Well, when I use this property here of show, the HTML element here of my dialog, it doesn't really like know if I'm using it as a modal or if I'm just using it as like a sub component within my page and stuff. So it doesn't really know if I should have a backdrop or not. And if you look at this right here, it says the backdrop CSS pseudo element can be used to style the backdrop that is displayed behind a dialog element when the dialog is displayed with the show modal method. So in order to use that backdrop CSS pseudo element property to change the backdrop styles, you need to use the show modal method like I did in my first implementation of this, rather than implementing it with this state within React here, which this is, I think, still a fine way to do it, but I would probably implement it the first way just so I can keep using that CSS there like I did initially, just to give you more flexibility there. And you can also imagine that you could, pass in some different props here, or you could, render out the children, and then you could render out, instead of just saying, this is my dialog, I could say children. And then when I render this within my app, instead of just rendering it like this, I could pass in some children here, and I could say, this is the child of my dialog. And then when I go back to my app and I get off MDN and I open it, you see this is the child of my dialog. So this would make it definitely more customizable, just like any React component. You could set this up to actually pass like props or pass in some text here as children or whatever you might do, and then just render that within your dialog as well. So hopefully that gives you some ideas of using it within React as well, and also covers kind of that gotcha with the show modal method and using the backdrop. But yeah, hope that helps, and I'll see you in that next one.